Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be starting a brand new series entitled This Is Not a Series on Postmodernism, which despite its title is actually going to be a series about postmodernism. In this video we're going to be covering the basics of what is postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is an aesthetic and philosophical movement which rose to prominence in the second half of the 20th century. Postmodernism is very hard to define because it is a set of very loosely connected movements and positions which occurred in art, architecture, literature, politics, and philosophy around about the same period of time. The first sentence of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on postmodernism acknowledges this heterogeneity. Quote, that postmodernism is indefinable is a truism. While there are some common threads that run through many of these movements, these are often quite general and abstract, and so giving a one single definition of postmodernism is quite challenging, which is why we're going to be doing a whole series on it. This video is going to look at some of the common linkages between the various things that have been called postmodernism, and future videos in the series will look at both some of the general terms that are used in postmodernism to provide you some definitions, as well as specific versions of postmodernism as they're applied in architecture, performance, philosophy, science, etc. Before diving in, it's important to note that postmodernism is not one single position. One might be an architectural postmodernist, but a philosophical modernist, and not care for either modern or postmodern performance. Holding an opinion on a particular aesthetic does not commit one to a particular political or philosophical position with respect to postmodernism. Given the complexity of this topic, many uninformed critics fallaciously claim that postmodernism is a united worldview, and the rejection of one concept constitutes the rejection of all, pointing to postmodernist paintings as a reason to reject postmodernist philosophy is deeply flawed and fallacious. This is inaccurate. We're going to address the criticisms of specific types of postmodernism in turn. We will certainly not shy away from those criticisms. But the claim that this is a single united position and the criticisms of one type of postmodernism apply to all types of postmodernism is simply false. There's also often a fallacious attempt to brand postmodernism as an ethical thesis, i.e. the world should be this way. This is what we want the world to be, as opposed to a metaphysical one. In other words, that the world simply is this way. Postmodernism is generally a descriptive claim about the way the world is, not the way that it should be. So simply because you don't like the conclusions of a given postmodernist position, it doesn't mean that it is wrong. So this is often another fallacious claim leveled against postmodernism that, we don't like whether it's the ethical or the cultural or the political ramifications of postmodernism being true, therefore it can't be true. Postmodernism is not an ethical thesis, generally, about the way the world should be. Rather, it is a metaphysical thesis about the way the world is, and if that is a problem for you, it is not the fault of postmodernism, but postmodernism is simply describing facts about the world. So it's hard to frame this generally, and in the individual videos we will cover this in greater depth. This is not to say we're not going to be offering objections to postmodernism. We're going to be offering many objections. This is just to set aside some of those kind of fallacious objections that are often thrown out there, which don't actually work because they are based on a basic misunderstanding of what postmodernism is. So, setting that aside, let's move on. So the central question that carries through many types of postmodernism is whether there is only one right way to do things, or whether we can judge a final product objectively using rules. On both counts, postmodernists are skeptical. One way to understand postmodernism, then, is to contrast it with the equally elusive concept of modernism. For the modernist, very broadly, there is one right way of doing things. Something which is independent of history, culture, or paradigm, whether that is art, justice, or truth. We can make progress towards that goal and judge if we are getting closer. We are getting closer to the perfect piece of art, the most just system, or the truth about reality. This is the modernist conception. For the postmodernist, on the other hand, experience is pluralistic. There are many right ways to do something, and those are dependent on things outside of that thing itself, such as the method used to create it, or its historical, linguistic, cultural context. And since there's not one single goal, we are not making progress towards that one goal. There are multiple goals. There's a plurality of goals, all of which can be right depending on their context. So one way you might think of this is that modernists think that all tasks are like calculating the digits of pi. There's one right answer, and we're always moving closer to it. We might never perfectly achieve it, but we're always getting closer to the correct answer to what are all the digits of pi. Postmodernists, on the other hand, think that all tasks are like coming up with new ways to use a rubber band. There are endless uses of a rubber band, and you can't judge whether they are good or a bad use outside of the context or situation you're in. Hitting someone in the face with a rubber band may be a good use in some situations, but a bad use in others. Whether it's good or bad is dependent on the context, not something inherent about the method. The question is whether you think that a given discipline, whether it's art, science, politics, philosophy, is doing something that looks more like finding pi, or something more like finding a new use for a rubber band. And you might think that one discipline fits one model better, but another discipline fits the other model better, which is why neither modernism nor postmodernism is something that is all-encompassing, that fits all of these disciplines. Rather, it's something that can be specific to a certain discipline. You might think that science looks more like calculating the digits of pi, but art looks more like finding different uses for a rubber band. Another way to think of postmodernism is as a rejection of quote-unquote meta-narratives. This is how Jean-François Lyotard, one of the first philosophers to speak of postmodernism, defined it. And we're going to cover both a specific definition of meta-narratives and Lyotard's position in later videos, but here's a basic introduction. So meta-narratives are broad stories that contextualize many smaller stories, whether that's in the news, history, data points in a discipline, etc. Political positions like socialism or Nazism are meta-narratives because they explain a set of stories or occurrences in an overarching story of the oppression of the proletariat or the need for the dominance of a master race. However, you can have other things that are meta-narratives. So once again, a meta-narrative is that broad overarching story that explains all the individual instances of your day-to-day life. A scientific paradigm is also a type of meta-narrative, such as classical mechanics, because it is explaining all of the individual instances of the way that things move in terms of a broad overarching set of rules or stories. Aesthetic paradigms like artistic realism or religious worldviews, such as a particular religious doctrine, or historical paradigms like the idea that we are making progress in society, are also types of meta-narratives against which we judge our beliefs and experiences. For the postmodernist, you can test your belief against a given meta-narrative. So within a cultural context, within a scientific paradigm, within a political kind of storytelling or narrative, you can test a given belief or a given explanation of something. For example, does a particular theory follow the laws of classical mechanics? Does a particular painting follow the rules of realism, etc.? But the meta-narratives themselves cannot be proven or tested. There's no way to prove we should be painting a realist painting. Lyotard was particularly focused on the meta-narratives that we are making progress towards total knowledge and that we're making progress towards a just society. But like I said, we'll cover more on Lyotard in a future video. This is just a basic introduction. Another way to think of this term is about theories of truth. As a means of analogy, though, not because either modernists or postmodernists necessarily accept either a correspondence or a coherence theory of truth. Check out my videos on correspondence and coherence theories of truth for more on that. Modernists are similar to correspondence theories of truth in that they think there's some fact of the matter out there that can be studied, which makes some paintings beautiful and others ugly, some laws just and others unjust. We can list objective criteria to check whether a final product, a painting, fits those criteria of, is this beauty? You check 5 boxes, you're beautiful. Postmodernists, on the other hand, think that the only reason that we think a piece of art is beautiful is that it coheres with the particular context or cultural that we were brought up in, and that in other contexts, we might draw different conclusions. There's not one right way to interpret a given piece of art. Someone in one cultural context might interpret it one way, someone in another cultural context might interpret it another way. Or the empirical data received from an experiment. Interpretation depends on the background beliefs of the observer, such as the scientific paradigm you're based in. The data from an experiment can lead to different conclusions depending on the particular scientific paradigm you are in. It depends on the background beliefs of the observer, whether you're a realist or a surrealist, whether you're a classical mechanist or a quantum mechanist. Unlike the coherence theorist, however, they don't necessarily think that this makes the claims true. Just because you cohere to a particular cultural context or meta-narrative, it doesn't mean that that claim is full-on true. But really, that's just all we can say about that claim, that it coheres within a certain meta-narrative. Yet another way to think about postmodernism is in terms of the rules of board games. For the modernist, there's only one game to be played with one set of rules. For the postmodernist, whether you're following the rules or not depends on the game you're playing. The postmodernist can still say that you shouldn't roll dice when playing chess because it doesn't fit your particular context, but they would not say you should never roll dice, since there might be another game where that would be appropriate. The modernist disagrees, claiming that there's only one set of rules that are objective and that we can discover and make progress towards following. This isn't to say that modernists say there's only one right game of chess, though in some contexts they might, rather to use it as an analogy of, in all of these different particular disciplines, the modernist is saying there's one right way to do this, whereas the postmodernist is saying there's many right ways to do this. Now, while this idea of pluralism that we've been talking about so far is central to all aspects of postmodernism, there are other aspects which can be found to various degrees in the individual disciplines that we're going to cover. Generally, these are compared with modernist conceptions and contrasted with them. These will be explained more in subsequent videos with specific examples of how they apply in all of these disciplines, so your head shouldn't explode if you don't understand or get a sense of all of these right away. But hopefully this will give you an overarching sense of some of the broad themes that cut across multiple movements within postmodernism. So we have the modernist conceptions on one side and the postmodernist on the other. Modernism, a central theme, is the rejection of classical styles, whereas postmodernism generally marries classical styles with modern styles. For modernists, form follows function, whereas for postmodernists, form is more central, function is less important. For modernists, the final product is primary, whereas for postmodernists, the process of creating that product is primary. For modernists, works transcend any place or culture. There are objective works that we can go out and discover that should be made and are objectively beautiful. Whereas for the postmodernist, works are culturally situated. Something that's beautiful in one context might be ugly in another. Modernism is about simplicity. It's about reducing the ornamentation and the excess. Whereas for postmodernists, complexity is important. Multiple layers, multiple access points, double coding of ideas is important. For the modernists, there's often one single artist's vision that's going into a piece of work, whereas for the postmodernists, there can be many artists' visions, and pieces of art are often created collectively as opposed to by one single individual person. For the modernist, there's one right interpretation of a piece of literature, of a sentence, of a piece of art, whereas for the postmodernist, there are multiple possible interpretations. For the modernists, there are objective facts about whether something is beautiful or something is true. For the postmodernists, those claims are more subjective and dependent on the meta-narrative you're operating in. The modernists have faith in meta-narratives and often espouse certain meta-narratives themselves, whereas the postmodernists have skepticism of those meta-narratives. Not that they don't think that they exist, but rather that they are skeptical that there's one that is right. For the modernists, there are gatekeepers that are needed to preserve institutions, whereas for the postmodernists, those same gatekeepers serve to preserve existing power structures, not to preserve those institutions, and those institutions would continue to exist even without those gatekeepers and might be better without them. Modernism is about conformity to one set of rules. Postmodernism is about individualism and the allowance that there doesn't need to be a single set of rules that all works of art follow. Modernism works within a single medium generally. You don't have the crossover between multiple mediums that you see within postmodernism, where you might have works that combine both technology and classical mediums of art. For the modernist, art represents reality. Art is a representation of something that is out there in the world, whether that is an abstract form or a realist portrayal of an event. Whereas for postmodernists, art represents itself. Art is self-referential and is containing pastiche and parody of other artistic works and is corresponding to and conversing with a larger artistic dialogue that's going on. From the modernists, art is about original ideas. You have this sense of originality in modernism, that people are saying, we're doing something new, we're doing something that's never been done before, that's completely disconnected from the past. Whereas for postmodernists, art is much more importantly about pastiche and parody. It's about connecting to art that has gone before. It's about creating cultural references and referencing earlier ideas and concepts, and parodying those ideas and commenting on them and twisting them and changing them into new contexts. Modernism says that the important art is high art, whereas for the postmodernists, you can have art that is both high, that is advancing the edge of art, but is also popular art, that is engaging people, that is bringing in new people. And for the postmodernist, you can have double-coded art, which both serves a popular art perspective, but also speaks to kind of high art concerns. Whew! That was a lot of information. And it is a little bit overwhelming at this point because we're covering a lot of different fields. We're covering art and aesthetics as well as kind of philosophy and philosophy of science and everything that comes in. As we go on in this series, we'll piece out the parts that are specifically referencing to art, that are referencing to aesthetics, kind of between art and philosophy, and those that are focused mostly on philosophy. But to understand this better, and to understand its critics, we need to look into particular instances of postmodernism, because hopefully something we have portrayed in this video is that postmodernism, while a very broad topic, doesn't have as much meaning unless it is applied to the specific individual movements that happen within specific disciplines that are called postmodern. As noted at the beginning, while these positions bear some similarities to each other, they do not imply each other and may be taken as independent positions. The first 3 videos in this series are going to look at 3 specific terms which are used in postmodernism broadly and which can be used across disciplines, and they're concepts that we'll see come up time and again. The next 3 videos in the series are going to focus on postmodernism as a position in aesthetics, its impact on architecture, and its impact on performance and the philosophy of art. Because that type of postmodernism looks very different in some ways from the postmodernism that we'll see later in the series that applies to science, that applies to politics, and that applies to philosophy. So the next 5 videos look at postmodernism as a philosophical position focusing on philosophy of science, politics, language, truth, and reason. And the final 2 videos are going to look at the relationship between postmodernism and 2 specific, closely related, but importantly distinct philosophical positions, both feminism and skepticism. And in that final video, we will look at some of my, as the skeptics, arguments against postmodernism. We'll cover objections to postmodernism throughout the series, but that video we will take kind of very specifically from the skeptic's perspective, some of the reasons you might be doubtful of postmodernism as an ideology. Whew! So with all that out of the way, one quick note before we get into the video. So before moving on to the individual videos, it's important to note that various positions in line with general postmodernist conceptions arose in both the analytic tradition of philosophy, so you see this in Quine, you see this in Kuhn, you see this in Wittgenstein, and the Continental tradition of philosophy, Lyotard, of course, Derrida, Foucault, etc. Though many provide Lyotard with privilege of place because Lyotard wrote specifically on, quote unquote, the postmodern condition, and therefore lean a discussion of postmodernism strongly on the continental aspects, we are not going to do that. We are going to try to, as much as I can, split down the middle, and when we get to the very philosophy-based claims around postmodernism, cover both the claims that are coming from the analytic side and the continental side. And so in doing that, because my background's in analytic philosophy, this is going to look more like an analytic take on postmodernism than something that you might traditionally see, but we are going to try to cover the continental elements as well. Now, part of the reason for this is because there's a lack of a sufficiently specific definition of postmodernism to clearly delineate to philosophies that fit the criteria and those that do not. So there may be some fudge room on the edges. You may have someone arguing with me saying, no, this really isn't postmodernism, or that is. We're going to set those aside and broadly say, under this very broad understanding of kind of a narrative of pluralism versus a narrative of one specific goal or one specific ideology of modernism that we framed here, which of these philosophers' positions can be thought into this. This series will include references, as I said, to both the continental sides and the analytic sides of the postmodernist movement. Whew! So with that, let's take a look at the videos you're going to see in this series. So, first off, we're going to get some terminology. So what is a meta-narrative? We explained it a bit here, but we're going to go into a bit more depth. Then we'll look at what is a simulacrum. Then we'll take a look at what is the problem of reinscription. These are all kind of some basic concepts that will be useful throughout our further study of postmodernism. Next, we'll move on to the world of art. We'll look at what is postmodern architecture. Then we'll take a look at what is postmodern performance, how postmodernism influenced theater and performance. And finally, within the art section, we'll look at what is postmodern aesthetics, kind of looking at some of the crossovers and starting to edge into philosophy of art and how some of these movements within art influenced our conceptions of aesthetics, what is beautiful, and how that bled into philosophy to a certain degree. Then we'll take a look at what is paradigm shift, Thomas Kuhn and postmodern science. So we'll take a look at Thomas Kuhn's theory of paradigm shift and how it relates in some ways to postmodernism and how it doesn't necessarily relate in all ways to postmodernism, but the connections we can draw between Kuhn and the postmodern stories that we're telling. Next, we'll take a look at what is postmodern political philosophy. Hint, it is not Marx and Marxism. Marxism is a meta-narrative, but we'll talk more about kind of meta-narratives within political philosophy and how postmodernism relates to them. Then we'll take a look at what is postmodernism philosophy of language. As you might guess by the Beetle, we will be talking about Wittgenstein here, but also about other philosophers in the Continental tradition as well. Then we'll take a look at what is postmodernism, postmodern philosophy of truth. This is the video where we're going to delve a little bit more, both into, as the image might suggest, Tarski's proofs of the indefinability of truth, but on the Continental side as well, Lyotard and works there. And then we'll take a look at what is postmodern philosophy, specifically ways that postmodernists conceive of rationality, reason, and logic, both on the Continental and on the analytic side of the ocean. Then finally, the last two videos, we'll look at, is feminism postmodern? There's an interesting debate to be had here, as much as there's often a dismissal of course, feminism is something that's completely separate from postmodernism. It's a meta-narrative in itself. Within certain parts of the postmodern tradition, feminism plays a very, very important role, and dismissing that is problematic. So we're going to cover both of those sides of that in this video. And finally, of course, we will look at skepticism versus postmodernism. Skepticism is often confused with postmodernism, and they are importantly distinct, as I, as a Pyrrhonian skeptic, will be the first to tell you. So we'll take a look at a lot of the skeptics' objections to postmodernism in that. Whew! That was a big old video. It's going to be a big series. Postmodernism is a really complex topic, so I hope you stick with us for this series. And I hope that it can be really helpful in delving into all of the aspects of this complex movement that covers so many different areas, and many people are confused about what it means. So, for now, in the comments, let me know, what do you think? Is there a right way to do art? Can scientific theories be tested outside of a paradigm? Are we making progress towards justice, or are we just spinning our wheels? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please do subscribe, hit the notification bell if you're interested in this series and you want to stay up to date on it. It was a lot to put together, but I do think this is a very interesting concept within philosophy, and it's a concept where there's a lot of confusion about it. So hopefully, as we go through this whole series, we can alleviate some of that confusion, and give you a better sense of postmodernism. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everyone.